Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Ever feel like the Cold War is just one big, confusing game of chicken with nukes? Both sides are just barreling towards a cliff, and whoever swerves first loses.
It's a period that continues to fascinate, isn't it?
Yeah.
This constant tension, this very real threat of nuclear war. We're going to unpack two pivotal events that brought the U.S. and the Soviet Union dangerously close to turning that Cold War very, very hot. The Berlin Crisis and the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Buckle up, listeners. This is high-stakes history. But before we get to the brink, let's set the stage a little bit. It's the Cold War. The U.S. is championing democracy and capitalism. And while the USSR, on the other hand, is pushing for communism. Both want to spread their ideology, but neither actually wants a nuclear apocalypse.
Precisely. It's like, imagine a global chess match. Each side making these calculated moves, but always aware of the devastating potential of their pieces. Now, place yourself in a divided city, Berlin. This is where our first crisis unfolds.
Okay, so Berlin is literally split in two. West Berlin, this little capitalist island in the middle of communist East Germany. I bet that caused some tension at the grocery store.
Oh, more than tension. West Berlin became this powerful symbol of what East Germans could have: freedom, opportunity, you name it. And it led to a mass exodus, with people risking their lives to escape to the West.
Wow. Talk about a pressure cooker. I'm guessing Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union, wasn't too happy about this mass exodus.
Not at all. In 1958, Khrushchev issued an ultimatum. The West had to leave Berlin. He gave them 6 months. This was classic brinkmanship, pushing the situation to its limit, hoping the West would back down.
Nerves of steel, indeed. But wasn't the U.S. playing a similar game with their nuclear arsenal?
To a degree. Eisenhower's New Look policy, it was this, complex balancing act, really. It emphasized nuclear deterrence, the whole threat of massive retaliation as a way to project strength while trying to keep traditional military spending in check. However, this reliance on nukes also had its drawbacks, creating this constant atmosphere of fear and uncertainty.
This sounds like a recipe for disaster, wouldn't you say? And right on cue, we have a U.S. U-2 spy plane being shot down over Soviet territory in 1960. Not exactly the best timing.
A major setback for diplomacy, for sure. The incident completely derailed a planned summit between Eisenhower and Khrushchev, which only deepened mistrust and escalated tensions even further. And the consequences of this breakdown in communication, they're about to become tragically clear in Berlin.
Because just a year later, in 1961, the Berlin Wall goes up. Can you imagine the feeling of utter hopelessness as a physical barrier cuts through your city, your community, even your families, practically overnight?
The Berlin Wall became an enduring symbol of Cold War division, a stark reminder of the human cost of this ideological standoff. And while the immediate crisis subsided, the underlying tensions, they never really went away. The Berlin Wall, it really underscored just how quickly things could escalate. I mean, how a city, a nation, the world even, could be cleaved in two, just like that, by suspicion and ideology. But if you thought that was tense, well...
Let's shift gears to 1962 and the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Exactly. A standoff that brought the world to the brink, no question.
Okay, so now we're talking Cuba, just 90 miles off the coast of Florida, practically America's backyard, right? What possessed Khrushchev to put nuclear missiles there?
Well, from Khrushchev's perspective, it was a calculated risk.
Calculated risk?
Yeah, you see, remember the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961?
The failed attempt by the U.S. to overthrow Fidel Castro?
Exactly. That event, it only solidified Soviet fears, right, of a U.S. invasion of Cuba. Placing nuclear missiles there, in their eyes at least, was a way to deter such an action, to protect their ally, Castro.
So they were trying to level the playing field after the U.S. put missiles in Turkey? Is that what you're saying?
You could put it that way.
I get the logic, in a way. But talk about a power play.
Oh, absolutely.
How did the U.S. respond to this little surprise?
This wasn't just a power play. It was a potential nuclear checkmate. Imagine the pressure on President Kennedy. Soviet missiles capable of reaching U.S. soil within minutes. He called it a clear and present danger, and rightfully so.
Oh, I can only imagine the tension in the White House. What options did Kennedy even have at that point?
Well, after days of deliberation with his advisors, days that became known as the XCOM meetings, Kennedy, he made a decision. He announced a naval quarantine of Cuba.
A quarantine? What's that, some new Cold War jargon?
Essentially a blockade, but there's a nuance there.
Hold on a second. A quarantine? That sounds a bit like trying to, I don't know, put a Band-Aid on a bullet wound. Why not just call it what it was, a blockade, and be done with it?
You've hit upon a crucial point. It was a calculated move, both in action and in language. A blockade under international law is technically an act of war.
Ah, I see where you're going with this.
By using the term quarantine, Kennedy aimed to give the Soviets a chance to back down without appearing weak, you see.
So it was a high-stakes poker game, with each side carefully choosing their words, their actions, everything.
Absolutely. Every move mattered.
And let me guess. The world was holding its breath during those 13 long days in October 1962.
Oh, the tension was palpable. Not just in Washington and Moscow, but across the globe. The possibility of nuclear war, once a distant threat, it suddenly felt terrifyingly real. Newspapers ran headlines about fallout shelters, and families, they huddled around radios, anxiously awaiting updates.
And in the end, who blinked first?
It wasn't so much about blinking as it was about finding a way out of a seemingly impossible situation, really. Khrushchev, after much back and forth, agreed to, remove the missiles from Cuba. In return, the U.S. publicly pledged not to invade Cuba.
A win-win situation, then. The world could finally breathe a collective sigh of relief.
It appeared so on the surface, yes. But remember those U.S. missiles in Turkey, the ones that, in part, led to this whole standoff in the first place.
Right.
There was a secret agreement, one that wouldn't be revealed for decades, that the U.S. would remove those missiles as well.
Talk about backroom deals. It makes you wonder, just how close did we come to nuclear war without even realizing it? So they managed to step back from the brink, but with some, let's say, interesting caveats. Did those close calls, especially the Cuban Missile Crisis, change the game? Did it force the U.S. and the Soviets to find a safer way to coexist?
You could say it was a wake-up call, absolutely. The Cuban Missile Crisis, with its threat of, mutually assured destruction, that chilling reality that both sides had enough nukes to wipe each other off the map, basically.
Yeah.
Well, it made the unthinkable all too real. Both Kennedy and Khrushchev, even with their ideological differences, they recognized the need for, let's just say, more stable relations.
No more playing chicken with the fate of the world.
Not quite. The threat, it was still there, lurking beneath the surface. But there was a shift, like a thawing of that Cold War frost. It ushered in an era we call détente, basically a period of ease, tensions, more dialogue, even some cooperation on issues like arms control, believe it or not.
Arms control, now that's a welcome change.
And get this, they installed a direct line of communication between Washington and Moscow, to prevent future misunderstandings.
They called it the hotline, right?
That's the one.
Imagine picking up the phone and it's Khrushchev on the other end. Talk about pressure. But seriously, it's amazing how such a terrifying event could lead to something so practical, so important.
Sometimes it takes a brush with catastrophe to illuminate a path forward. But even now, all these years later, the interpretation of these crises, it's still debated among historians.
A historical tug-of-war.
In a way, it's like looking at a sculpture from different angles, right?
Yeah.
Each perspective gives you a different understanding of the whole.
So let's break down those perspectives. We've got the Orthodox historians, for example. What's their take on these Cold War showdowns?
Orthodox historians, they tend to view these crises through the lens of, U.S. containment policy. The idea that the U.S. had to stand firm against Soviet expansionism no matter what.
Stop them in their tracks, kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. They argue that the U.S. successfully prevented the spread of communism in Berlin and in Cuba. Well, they say the U.S. forced Khrushchev to back down. They see it as a victory, plain and simple, a victory for the West.
Okay, so that's one side. But I'm guessing the revisionist historians, they see things a bit differently.
You'd be right about that. Revisionists are, shall we say, more critical of U.S. actions, especially in Cuba. They argue that the Bay of Pigs invasion, for instance, was a reckless provocation that basically pushed Khrushchev to take such drastic measures.
So the U.S. may have actually escalated the crisis by trying to assert its dominance?
That's the gist of their argument, yes.
It's like that old saying, there are three sides to every story, your side, my side, and the truth. So where does the truth lie? Do the post-revisionists have an answer?
Post-revisionists, like John Lewis Gaddis, they offer, a more nuanced view. They emphasize the role of miscalculation and misperception on both sides.
Ah, so both sides share some of the blame.
Exactly. Remember that secret deal to remove U.S. missiles from Turkey? It really highlights how each side was operating in the dark, with incomplete information, often misinterpreting the other's motives.
So it wasn't just about good guys and bad guys. It was about this fundamental lack of understanding of communication.
Precisely. And that's a sobering thought, isn't it? It reminds us that even the most powerful leaders, they can make mistakes, that miscommunication can have devastating consequences, and that understanding the other side's perspective, well, it's crucial to avoiding conflict.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into these pivotal moments in history, what key takeaways should we, the listeners, carry with us? What's the so what of all of this?
We've explored how seemingly small events can spiral out of control, how ideological differences can become very real barriers, and how close we came to nuclear war. Not once, but multiple times. Perhaps the most crucial takeaway is this. The lessons of the Cold War, even though they're from decades ago, are still incredibly relevant today.
It's like history's trying to teach us something if we're willing to listen.
We can't afford to ignore those hard-won lessons.
Exactly. And as we try to navigate the complexities of the 21st century with all its global challenges and potential flashpoints, well, understanding the Cold War, the dangers of brinkmanship, the importance of clear communication, it's more vital than ever, wouldn't you say?
Without a doubt.
And on that note, listeners, I'm going to leave you with this. We often hear that those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it right.
Right.
But what about the mistakes we don't even know we're making, the echoes of the past playing out in the present? Until next time, keep asking those what-if questions, keep learning, and remember, history might not repeat, but it sure does rhyme.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.